This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we travel across the pond to the United Kingdom, where we welcome Bishop Andrew Ramsey, Bishop of Ramsbury. Try saying that 10 times fast. Bishop Andrew has a brand new book titled English Grounds, a Pastoral Journal. In this journal of short, lyrical reflections, Bishop Andrew takes the reader on an exploration of faith, place, and identity. Today we are excited to celebrate and discuss the theology of place and further dive into his book.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. Welcome to another edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast. The Vicar's Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. We're glad to be back with you here on our 6th episode of Season 6. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
And I happen to be Kevin George from St. Aidan's Anglican Church in London, Ontario as well.
And last time I checked, my name is Ian, and I'm a producer and the person who brings this podcast out to your ears and also eyes. Hello.
So, guys, today we're taking a little trip to jolly old England. We're going across the pond, and excited to welcome Bishop of Ramsbury, Andrew Rumsey. I almost got those two mixed up.
That's a
Bishop
tricky,
Rumsey of Ramsbury.
That's a tricky thing. That Ramsbury thing, I gotta say, is a tricky thing.
Mm-hmm. But Bishop Andrew is suffragan bishop in the Diocese of Salisbury, and he is also an author whose writing centers on theology of place and themes around local identity. And he is also a musician with a long-standing interest in songwriting and popular music. And interesting fact, he was a bandmate of a friend of the podcast, Malcolm Guite.
Shout out to Malcolm.
In a band called the Crocodiles. So we're going to ask him about that.
Yes.
All right, when we chat
I
with him.
can't help but think of Elton. Do you think of Elton when you hear that?
Elton John?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course. Crocodile Rock. The Crocodile Rock, of course. But he's got a book out right now, and I'm going to hold it up for our YouTube watchers. English Grounds, a Pastoral Journey, and some great reflections in here on place and church and much, much more. So we'll talk to him in just a moment.
I didn't know you were on first base names with Elton John, Kevin.
Oh, me and Elton, we go a long way back.
Yeah, we just Elton. Yeah.
In fact, I know him so well that I call him Reg.
Right, of course.
Reggie. Hey, Reggie. You don't look broke.
Yeah.
Those of you who watch North American ads will know what I'm talking about. You don't look broke. Anyway, listen, before we do any of that, we want to acknowledge the land upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. On the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and a dish with one spoon covenant wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we respect as contemporary stewards of the land, vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we wish to work towards wholeness and reconciliation between all peoples.
We want to also say thank you to our sponsors today on the Vicar's Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. Our thanks to Dave Mullen, and hi to everybody over at A. Miller George today.
Hello, AMG people. This is a shout out to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy here in London, Ontario is locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Get yourself away from the big box. Get over and see Carol Basada. She'll hook you up with all your prescription needs and even some over-the-counter needs. Just go see Carol at Hyde Park Care Pharmacy.
And last, but certainly not least, I cannot stress that enough, we have Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trish Lister over there is the wonderful human being who hooked us up with that. So thank you to them over there.
Season 6 is clicking along here, and we've got more folks to join us over the next weeks to come. So, Kevin, it's time now for our latest segment on the Vicar's Crossing, which we like to call Who in the World Did We Book This Week?
Oh, am I ever glad you asked. Who did I book this week? Drum roll, please. And I'm happy to say this week we booked Carol Howard Merritt to come and speak with us about her book called Healing Spiritual Wounds. And just a beautiful book, sort of picking up on some of the themes that we've talked about on here. When we had Brian Alain on, he talked about healing our divides. There's just a lot going on in our culture right now, and certainly here in Canada as we watch this continued occupation in Ottawa. I don't know about you, Rob, but I'm finding there's people that I know that I just can't believe they hold some of these attitudes, and there just seems to be a lot of division. And books like this and people like Carol Howard Merritt, who are working to sort of bring us closer together, badly needed.
Yeah, very much so. And we'll look forward to talking to her. That's great. We are going to be talking to Bishop Andrew, who is checking in. It's a little late for him. He's kind enough to join us in the evening. So we'll get to him, and he'll hopefully have a couple of cups of coffee on the go. And we'll chat with him about his new book, English Grounds, A Pastoral Journey. And here comes the bishop.
Yeah, let's just hope he's had a quiet day. Let's welcome him in.
I hope so. And we are so happy to welcome Bishop Andrew to the Vicar's Crossing podcast today, hopping across the pond. And Andrew, so good to have you here. Welcome. How is everything with you?
It's great to be with you guys. Yeah, all's well, thank you. I'm exhausted. I've spent the day with a group of 312-year-olds who have been...
Oh, my goodness.
Good Lord.
About my life and work as a bishop. And as you can imagine, they ask the best questions.
Of course. So we're really pushing it, because as we record this, it's 8 or 9 o'clock where you are. So we really appreciate you staying up late after a day with kids.
Wow. To talk for what sins did you have that inflicted upon you?
Oh, it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it, actually.
Yeah, I know you would. Yeah.
Good. So just for our listeners, you're in the Diocese of Salisbury. So whereabouts geographically would that be? And can you give us kind of a picture about where you are?
Yeah, I can. So Salisbury is really the gateway to the southwest of England, you might say. So once you reach Stonehenge and Salisbury, you're heading into the West Country.
Right.
And so I help look after the Church of England in Wiltshire, and the Diocese of Salisbury is pretty much a combination of Wiltshire and Dorset, which runs along the south coast of England.
Perfect. Okay. And we know too, there's a bit of a connection to a previous guest that we've had here on the Vicar's Crossing, which is Malcolm Geit. Malcolm's been on here with us, and we thoroughly enjoyed him. So we told him, I think we might be talking to you. So you guys were rock and rollers back in the day, huh? With the band of Crocodiles. I don't know if I've got those 45s around, but
do you have them, Rob? Rob, did you spin those when you were a DJ?
I might have.
Rob was a DJ. Rob, did you spin those on the radio?
I might have spun a few Crocodiles tunes here and there.
You'll have been looking for a long time for any 45 Crocodiles. We were let's call it an experimental outfit. And,
that's good.
I was only about 22 at the time, so this was at least 30 years ago. Malcolm was the only talented one in the band, to be honest. He played a mean guitar, so we got together in Cambridge, and I have to tell you that the band, before it was called the Crocodiles, was called Rocking Malcolm and the Revamps.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Rocking Malcolm, that's about right. Yeah,
that's great.
Well, we've all thoroughly fallen in love with Malcolm, and wonder how we need you to book once this madness is over that we're dealing with. You need to book a trip. We need to both of you over here for a whole variety of reasons, not least of which is appropriate adult beverages in the backyard of our church around a fire. So
we need a pub night for sure.
I'll be there.
So. Is it true that the first Bishop of Ramsbury was appointed in 909?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Oh, wow. You guys have some history over there. Right? Like we're so, like Rob and I are in churches that are Rob, 50, 60 years old.
Yeah. That's about it.
It's staggering, isn't it? There were at least two saints in the original bishops of Ramsbury, including one called Saint Oda the Severe.
Oh,
imagine having earning as in your life and work as a bishop, earning the nickname, not nickname, but properly into history as Oda the Severe.
Oh man, oh man.
What do you have to do to earn that?
Well, you got a lot to live up to, man.
Just so there was about 200 years of Anglo-Saxon and Norman bishops of Ramsbury. Then in 1075, very briefly, I won't go through the whole 1,000 years, but then it joined together with what was then Old Sarum, which is Salisbury, the old name for Salisbury. And Salisbury became more important, and Ramsbury had a brief pause of 900 years just to get over the previous Bishop of Ramsbury before reintroducing the title in the early 70s. Wow. So there was a kind of hiatus, and they then when they wanted another bishop in Salisbury diocese, they sort of reached into the like General Motors or what brands have we got back here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's great history. Yeah.
It's great history. Ramsbury, we'll dust off Ramsbury. And,
we'll just dust him off and see what we get. And he'll be, Andrew the crocodile.
Well, I love the history because it goes so far back. And like our diocese just celebrated a little while back the sesquicentennial. We did 150 years and went, oh, look how far we
look at how far back we go.
Then I, think about that kind of history.
Which never mind is an affront to the fact that there were people here long before our European settlers came and stole the land and did all that stuff. But anyway, listen, let's get on to English grounds. Before we get into some of the content in the book, let's start with the there you go, Rob, and I've got my copy sitting here as well. English grounds. Oh, I need to say to those listening, I got this. So Andrew and his folks were so kind as to send a couple of advanced copies to us. And back in early January, I sent my one copy over to Rob, and I kept a copy here. And I sat down to crack it open. And I go to the introduction, and this guy starts writing about how, this particular book is a culmination of 30 years experience in the American financial markets, and how excited he was to talk about American monetary policy. And I thought, what in the name of Jesus is this? This is not this is not what I thought it was at all. Then I closed it and I looked at the cover and it said English grounds. So I took the jacket off of it and looked on the spine and it said English grounds. And then I opened the cover again and the title page was a book about American monetary policy from some bloke in the United States from a different publisher even. So I have a collector's item is the long and short of it. You never got another one like that, did you?
No, that was the only one. We checked. Well, yeah, so it must have been the printer. Isn't that phenomenal?
I am keeping that. And I got to tell you, I read a paragraph. The other guy is not coming on our podcast. So let's start with English grounds, because the title itself is quite meaningful, and share a little bit with our listeners about the title and where it comes from, because the space itself has its own sort of interest. Right?
Yeah, it does. It does. And it's the name of a small stub of road in London, just south of the River Thames, and I came across it. Actually, I was on jury service about 5 years ago, and the name of the road for Southwark Crown Court, where I was serving for a few weeks, was called English Grounds, and I thought it was a fantastic phrase. And I was mulling over. I'd just written this book, Parish, and I was mulling over ideas for the next project. And this street name just stayed with me, and it happened to be down the road, really 5 minutes from Southwark Cathedral, which was my kind of mother church at the time as a priest in Southwark Diocese, and that's a meaningful part of the country for me. My father, who was a priest, began his ministry. He was ordained in Southwark Cathedral, and he started as a curate. in what was then late 50s, early 60s, South London, still some dockyards and bomb sites and old bits of industry, nothing like it is now. And then I was worked from, coming into Southwark regularly for 20 years, and then was ordained bishop there a few years ago. So Southwark is a really special place for me, and so English ground seemed to be a starting place, if you like, for thinking about how we know our place and our country only through particular spots like that.
Right. And there's as you say, even just standing there, and you described this in the book, given the history of your dad and all that, right? Like, you sort of notice. And it's interesting because that's how I came to know of your writing as well, was a post by Malcolm about going to your ordination as a bishop, and his writing about an experience he had in that neighborhood, right?
It's an amazing area, full of intense kind of London history and here.
Listen, you grew up, as you just said, but we would in over here in Canada, we'd say a PK, a preacher's kid. But I love the expression in your book, a vicarage child. And I really love that. And of course, we use the term vicar over here sort of to be cute. That's the podcast called The Vicar's Crossing. It's not a word that gets used that much anymore in Canada.
Oh, is it not? Okay.
No. And you reflect in the introduction what it meant for you to move often as you did as a child of a clergy person. And you smartly point out that, and quoting here, whether or not they stay put, being in transit, is intrinsic to the Christian understanding of place, for they are seeking a homeland as yet unseen. It will be fair to say that I'm never so fond of places, you write, as when traveling between them, leaving one, heading towards another on the way. And of course, I love that description, because as followers of Jesus, we truly are people on the way. And you're writing in this book and elsewhere, the book Parish is phenomenal, if I can commend it to people's reading as well, is a celebration of theology of place and its importance and the part that it plays in our lives. And it's incredible because you acknowledge the need we have to be rooted. And we just last week, this will be an interesting sort of back-to-back, Rob, because our last episode was with Randy Woodley, who's out on the West Coast of North America in Portland area, as Cherokee, and has just released a book called Being Rooted, which is about Indigenous spirituality and how it relates to his Christianity and so on. Really quite incredible. And so you really are talking about what it means to be rooted. And a little further on in the introduction, you write these words, and I'm just going to quote a little paragraph here, and then I promise there will be a question, Andrew. The need to belong, for place in its fullest sense, you write, is among the most pressing questions in public conversation. Across the globe, the devastation or denial of home is at the heart of geopolitical tension and international migration. Social media, being essentially dislocated, offers connection without context. Boy, is that ever important. Offers connection without context, tending to gather us around a heightened sense of personal identity or cast of opinion. The land is our mediator, and uprooted from place, we swiftly become too much for one another. The earthly city, wrote St. Augustine of Hippo, forms around the common objects, not the subjects of love. Community, in other words, is grounded in concerns beyond ourselves. The unfolding climate emergency, the Anthropocene's greatest test, asks questions of our love for God, land, neighbor, and demands that we return to the ground. This is something of a shock for those who grew up believing that the global village would enable us to transcend local allegiance. In fact, fairly emphatically, it has indicated the opposite. Andrew, as people long for home on a global scale, populist movements have stepped up all over the place and filled the vacuum that was there when those of us who yearn for these things are not prepared for the difficult conversations that go with that. Whether it's Brexit or Trump or the incredible trucker convoys we're seeing here in Canada right now, as you guys would call them, these lorry drivers, you know, it's incredible. You write about your country needing to find a common prayer, which I thought was really quite good. If there was ever a time for a need for some commonality, it certainly feels like it's now. Can you say more about how communities can be resilient without being defensive or even divisive? I think the expression you use in the book is little without being narrow.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely vital. And it's interesting that the ecological movement, the environmental movement, has recovered that sense of the need for small, resilient communities, and the idea of the parish actually in the last 30 years. So in Britain, a lot of environmental writers have homed in, kind of recovered, oh, there is this idea of parish, which carries with it, curiously, it carries the tension that you've just articulated between that kind of defensive attitude, because parochial, in one sense, is almost an insult, isn't it? It can mean small-minded, drawbridge pulled right up. Now, you know, narrowly insular, but of course at the same time, at the heart of that word is an open community for strangers and non-belongers, and at the heart of the origin of the word, the parochia, were those who lived paroikos, beside the house. In the Roman Empire, they were those who were the local strangers who lived outside the city walls, who weren't citizens of the empire. So the Christian community took on this as much as it did with ecclesia, you know, as the civil assembly, you know, it was one of the civil government terms. And I guess that it's not entirely clear why, because, and that's, you know, that's an area I tried to dig as deeply as I could into that in the last book, Parish, but one assumes that the early church took on board parochia, or parochia as it was, because they were the community that kind of belonged and kind of didn't belong. And a lot of our problems that are around defensive or nostalgic conceptions of community are because we make ultimate what is meant to be penultimate in Bonhoeffer's typology, you know, where he describes the need for the ultimate and penultimate places. We tend to see the present places that we love, whatever we love, we tend to see as ultimate, as the end of the world, you know, as I think our goal. But of course, we're given this remarkable, in scripture, this remarkable new ultimate place. You have to imagine, you have to kind of envisage, you have to sort of live it, and it will draw near. You can't possess it. It's the thing about the kingdom of heaven, you can't own it. You know, a lot of churches talk about growing the kingdom and building the kingdom. I know I'm a little bit suspicious of some of that language. The kingdom is really elusive. It's like a rare bird. It draws close. When you live in the way of Christ, it sort of draws in, and it's almost as soon as you name it and try to capture it, then it's gone again. And I think that's exactly as it should be, because we're aspiring to it. We're praying for it to come. And so I do think there is something at the heart of the Christian worldview which offers a way of being rooted in the land. I mean, after all, isn't that the story of Scripture, that there is the land is the basis of our promise and our encounter with God. It's good. There's no other way of encountering God but in place. So that's why, you know, the early church is only ever defined by being in Christ and being in its place, you know, of its place, in those early epistles. But it's not the end of the world, and we have to release our idolatry. And that's, I think, a bit of a model for how the church can view place in a way that's really helpful, because we mustn't possess it. We mustn't just be harking back to his lost Eden. We're meant to be pressing on for the New Jerusalem.
Well, and I think that's, you know, as it relates to settlers who came here to this country and displaced people from their land, right? I mean, that's the fallout of not knowing the importance and the reverence of these rooted places. We stole land, we stole people from the land, we displaced them from the land, we put them in places that were not their land, we institutionalized, we killed their children. Like it's, and all of that is in a way a testimony to the loss of just how important place is, that it's not just something you come and stick a stick in the ground and say, well, this is mine now.
Yeah. And I might add, I think that's so true. And I have to say that the Church of England has done its fair share of oppressive placeholding in this country as well. And one of the things I try to explore a little bit in the book is around our legacy here is the church was so landed, literally landed. It sided with the landed gentry. So when working people were taken off, the common land was enclosed and fenced in for sheep runs and so on. The church invariably just sided with the wealthy landowners. It was invested in the land, and it's to our great shame that we did that.
Yeah.
Well, we wanted to highlight some of the reflections in the book today, Andrew, with our listeners. So we were asking you to, I think, read a little bit from, is it Without a City Wall, I think was the section there.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is in some ways, I feel it's the most important piece in the book, and it's not about England. It's about Northern Ireland, and not every piece in the book's about England, but I wanted to give it a UK context as well, but seeing England from its, albeit not very far away, but a slightly remote place. And it was I think it's the first piece I wrote for the book, and it was a year or two before lockdown, on a visit of clergy to Belfast and Londonderry. And actually in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the 50th anniversary of what they call the Bloody Sunday shootings.
Right.
Here. So it's an appropriate piece to read for that. It's called Without a City Wall.
Thank you.
A frayed hole in the shoulder of a boy's coat. His photograph, moments before the puncturing bullet. Plum-coloured stains on that day's clothes, pegged up, unwashed. Remembrance is forensic here. The Museum of Free Derry, site of the Bloody Sunday shootings in January 1972, is a perpetual crime scene, an open wound of wailing tarmac. Every rag and relic, each faded Veronica devotedly kept on display. And what pains the aggrieved have taken, that we might stay to see what they still see. Images superimposed on a window overlooking the car park mark the precise place where our guide's brother fell, or where desperate friends carried another's slumping frame. An insistent haunting, this. Traumatic memory is prone to being replayed, scarring places and people like a scratch in a record. Events as explosive, as jarring as these are a barricade to the normal processions of time and space, and none of us is equipped to move beyond them. A cycle of violence is just that, the hurt we return to. Revolutions are rarely progressive, merely reenactment. Perhaps this begins to explain why, in Londonderry, the only complete walled city in Ireland, the past remains so encompassing and so well preserved. Bloodshed seizes our attention naturally enough, but more compelling yet are Derry's deep continuities and astounding powers of recall. The siege of the city in 1689 by the Catholic King James II, recently deposed from the English throne and looking to Ireland to regather his powers, moulded and cast the cultural imagination here. To keep this intact, the Apprentice Boys of Derry Association, named after 13 youths who slammed the Derry doors against Jacobite forces and whose relentless marching pounds their rebuttal into the landscape, has its own intensely curated museum. Within these walls, there is no surrender to time and history without relief. Such a concentrated defense of territory and tradition, spiked as it is with the bayonet of religious difference, feels uneasily biblical. On hallowed ground, local actions, British Army emplacements along the walls during the Troubles, for example, become inescapably prophetic and provocative. All things become soaked in their associations, including, it sinks in pretty swiftly, ourselves. Anglican visitors, implicated up to our collars in our nation's anesthetic detachment from the fallout of her own history. For, like John Lydon, there is no past in England's dreaming. Its sparks no longer ignite us. We can incinerate Guy Fawkes without a singe to our skin. But on these clouded hills, Derry, the London prefix being an English branding, feels like a British Jerusalem. So there is an aptness to the fact that Cecil Francis Alexander, who married the Anglican Bishop of Derry, wrote her enduring Good Friday hymn, "There is a green hill far away," gazing on the prospect from these battlements, where our clutch of clergy musters for its tour. How do we deal with crucifying memories beyond amnesia or fretful repetition? This is a question our guides, 2 priests, one Catholic and one Protestant, are committed to answering together, to finding within their sufferings the secrets of agreement. Peace is, in their view, a new anamnesis. On Bogside, a stone's throw below, the former scrawl of the Free Derry corner has become more pristine, more carefully typographical with each successive repainting. Insurgency turned into heritage, a national mistrust. The bus was quiet, returning to Belfast. Our pilgrim's tread now soft like trespass.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for putting us there. That's wonderful to hear that. That a great question though that you ask and that you thought about in your tour. How do we deal with crucifying memories beyond amnesia or fretful repetition? Indeed. And as we've already mentioned, here in Canada, we hold similar scars over things like colonialism, residential schools that we're dealing with now, stolen lands, genocide. Could you say maybe a bit more about, peace as a new anamnesis and what that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, that's at the heart of the cross, isn't it? And anamnesia is the only solution to amnesia, and that hopeful remembrance. And I can only come to the Lord's table at that point where past event, indeed past crucifixion, past salvation, and future hope meet in the present moment. Every time we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death, past event, recollection, remembrance, until he comes, future anticipation. I mean, you know that, and it's the only way to avoid, I think, the endless sort of rubbing the wound of the past is to look upon those scars made whole, not gone. The risen Christ still has the wounds, but they are glorified. They are healed and raised to be with God. And so there's a hopeful vision of the wounded life that we then pursue, and can then hopefully, easy to say, impossibly hard to do, we can hopefully look back without being captive to the past. We can look back and be captive instead to the future.
It sort of strikes me as, being able to look to Good Friday and not being captive by it, or being able to look to Good Friday and being captive, if captive to anything, to the hopeful vision of Easter, to the longing for, that thing that might come close to us, as you say, but, we're lured towards it constantly. But if we don't have Good Friday, if we don't have, we had a commission here called Truth and Reconciliation. Well, it was a 10-year process of hearing very difficult stories of the crucifixion. And what we're learning now, as technology is scanning graveyards, they're not graveyards, they're schoolyards, sadly, is that a lot of people never listen to those stories, because those stories were told. And now all of a sudden it seems shocking to people that the bodies are being, scanned, that the ground is being scanned, and it's proven there are all these bodies. And, I think sometimes we're afraid of that hopeful memory. Instead, we're so afraid of the painful memory that we refuse to listen with any hopefulness to raise up memory that might actually bring healing. No?
Yeah. I think that's where God's historic people, the Jews, have a great deal to teach us.
Yeah.
We need to wait and wail and acknowledge the death of Christ.
Yeah.
And the death of hope. He really did die.
Yes.
He really did die. So
another section of the book that I really enjoyed reading was the chapter titled Vectus. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that and get into talking a little bit about the church too. And in this reflection, you're having us think about, how the church struggles to define itself in a time when Christendom is receding. And we all know it and feel it. And those of us certainly who work for the church live it every day. And
history.
Exactly. Exactly.
Toast, man.
Cheers.
I'm hoping that there's a podcast career for me somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. If this doesn't work out,
I'm gonna bartend. Rob, how about you?
I was a DJ. I can go back.
Oh, you could go back to DJ. Yeah,
that's fine. But you take us to the Isle of Wight and All Saints Church, and in the reflection, you paint a beautiful picture of this setting. And I'm just kind of, as I'm reading it, I've got it in my mind, right? Of and visitors like myself, if I was to go over what we would see and what would we be drawn to in this space. And you're right. Plump as a row of hassocks, the cottages leading up to All Saints, God's Hill, form one of the Isle of Wight's picture postcard motifs. And
French
how many of us have these beautiful pictures and postcards of these lovely churches in different spots in the world? But I thought this was an excellent metaphor for the church today, because we often in the church want to create a church that communicates to our culture a message of a place where you come and we'll offer you all the peace and tranquility and wrap you in a nice warm blanket because that's what you need. Yet at the same time, though, that's not the story of Jesus, because the story of Jesus coming into the world, the incarnation of God in the world, was never about creating this nice soothing place to relax, but it was about entering into the pain of the world and the dark spaces of the world. So I was wondering if you could say more about this and maybe tell our listeners, because I love how you connected the Lily of the Cross, which is at All Saints Church. Can you tell us a bit about that too?
Yeah. It was thank you for asking. It was a striking church to visit, that not least because and I write about this in the book, it was next to a model village where there were at least 3 scaled down models of the same church
really?
growing up.
It's just like those Russian dolls.
The Russian dolls, yeah.
And right beneath the tower of the actual church. And it was just such a metaphor for, the Isle of Wight is in one sense, I love the Isle of Wight. It's not so very far from here, and I think it's a fabulous place. In one sense, it's almost a sort of little encapsulation of nostalgic England. And so this model village was quite a metaphor, really. But the church as a peaceful retreat. Well, I can only tell you what I praise God that it is a peaceful retreat. So I wouldn't want to deny the need for that. And at its best, at their best, these buildings are like the mountaintops that the Lord went up to be in a different kind of space where there was, well, as the poet said, my prayer has been valid, and you know, you're on a different kind of ground, and they take you. That transportation is really, really important. But what I said to the 12-year-olds today in school is, well, I'll say to you, is they asked what is the church for? What is the church? Building and people. And I said that the church is a rehearsal space for the kingdom of heaven. Which must have sounded just utterly baffling, but I then talked about the fact Jesus said there was this other place called the kingdom of heaven where you know, the unlovable the unloved are loved, and the homeless find a home, the sick are healed, you know, all the rest of it. The poor become rich, and we get the chance to practice what that place is like, and we do that in the church. And I talked about the fact that my best times at school, I didn't really enjoy school. My favorite times in school were rehearsing for the school play, where we were in a drama that was kind of real and was kind of unreal. It was in the present place, and yet it was kind of, we were going somewhere else, and we were working towards a final production that it just changed everything. Actually, it changed our friendships. It changed the way we did the dull stuff. In the meantime, because we were working our way, we were rehearsing for the play, and all of that. I said, at its best, church feels like that to me. When you're in church and it feels like it should, it feels like the school play rehearsals used to. We're practicing for a coming production.
Well, I love that reference to Jesus going up the mountaintop, because Jesus doesn't stay up there, right? Right. Like, that's the beauty of it, is that Jesus is transfigured in that place, and then the others want to stay because, well, church. So they want to stay, right? And he's like, well, hold on a second. Our friend John Marsh, who's the friend of the podcast here, he preached here a couple months back now, and when he was visiting from Vancouver, and he said what we were promised was the kingdom of God. What we got instead was the church. And we get too focused. We forget what Jesus was pointing towards, because we're busy looking at the finger, right? It's that expression. And so it's, I love that. I just love that, Andrew, that notion that, you know, it's important, because we do need to be wrapped up and soothed and comforted and transfigured and then sent. Yeah,
just so. And these wonderful buildings, at their best, are signposts, not only backwards. You know, there's in the book, I'm kind of wrestling with this because I feel it in myself. I am nostalgic by temperament. I love the past. History was my first discipline study, and that's, I'm most at home.
Well, I think many of us are.
If I'm feeling stressed, you know, if I'm feeling stressed or overwrought or overwhelmed, I go back. I go into reverse. Always. So I truly get that. But there's this tension always between Eden and the New Jerusalem, isn't there? You know, we're wanting to go back. And it's there in the scriptural stories as well. Let's go back.
Let's go back.
And the pressing forward is more uncertain. But at their best, the buildings not only give us the rooting in memory and past, they impel us forward too, point forward.
It sort of swings. There's a door that swings both ways, you know. So it's anyway. Listen, let's get you to read some more. Can you read from the book, The Groans of the Britons? And Ian will have a question for you on the other side. Probably something about, if I know Ian, it's probably something about the crocodiles or something. I don't know.
Please don't ask about the crocodiles. There's so little to say.
Okay. There goes my question.
I think he's got something else.
Okay. The Groans of the Britons. The Bath Road verge is by June virtually impassable. All the infant weeds that played about my ankles in April are now 5 feet high, jostling me as I push through. Tallest of all, giant hogweed can double that height and is, I find, quite beautiful in tone and form, if also fearsomely harmful. Its sap can burn like ammonia, so it pays to be watchful when brushing past. A caustic mood is scorching the land. We are wounded, aggrieved, immediate in our need and unsure of the ground before or ahead. On my mind for days has been a Bible passage from the Anglican lectionary, Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Remember the long way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, testing you to know what was in your heart. Remember the long way. I've been reading Anglo-Saxon history in the evenings, scouting the dark forest of English beginnings lit by occasional glades, a gildas here, a bead there, to guide the way. Unifying the nation then was an arduous business, obscure centuries of conflict and toil before British, Germanic and Danish races integrated under the same monarch, faith and tongue. Notwithstanding the bias of contemporary chroniclers, it may be no exaggeration to claim that the main agent of this gradual movement was the Christian Church, that, in historian Peter Hunter Blair's words, had the capacity to act as a unit in a country where political unity did not yet exist. By a fairly unassailable blend of administrative nous, monastic incubation of learning and creative arts, and a new unifying social ethic, the Gregorian vision that impelled Augustine to the Kent coast, that of a single English people under God, became a self-organizing reality. Within a century, the church had become the indispensable secretariat to the regional kingdoms, referee to each Game of Thrones. Crucially too, it was Christians who told the long story, for they could write. Weaving biblical narrative into the national scene, the monk Gildas described the island of Britain as poised in the divine balance which supports the whole world, as if it were the axis of history. Writing in the 6th century, as the receding legions left the Isles floundering against invasion, he describes how a wretched remnant made a final unheeded appeal to the Roman consul for help, headed the groans of the Britons. Whether or not Rome's eventual return to England as Christendom rather than empire was a prayer answered, it bound church and state in a knot we have yet to unravel. If the nation still groans, the church must groan with it. But in what voice? Such power as the Anglican Church retains is a curiosity to most and an offence to some, vestigial, deeply anachronistic. Artistic patronage and civil service long since shed, the last part, and the best, arguably, of the Anglo-Saxon body politic that this church may yet recover is the power of speech, a ministry of the word. National memory is ever selective, as we are realizing anew, always marshals the facts in order to tell a better story. Bede's ecclesiastical history was famously not a history of the church, but of the English people from the church's perspective. How to view the country's past is a tale that could usefully be told by an old institution, especially when we go to seed. Unlikely or archaic, these could be memories with a future.
Wow. As you noted in that reading, national memory is ever selective, and we can attest to that here in Canada as well. Excuse me. We can attest to that in Canada as well. You ask how the English might remember the country's past is a tale that could be usefully told by an old institution, especially when we go to seed, which is what you just said. And the turn of phrase of like memories with the future is just so interesting. Can you say more about the notion that the church may yet recover the power of speech and that ministry of the word?
Thanks, Ian. I mean, it may be a vain hope, but I was really struck by by the way in which again and again and again, the enduring role of the church, it seemed to me, perhaps just as a would-be historian, is that they told the story. The Christian scholars had a knack for narrative because they were biblically, immersed. So they told the story of England as if it was the next installment of scripture. That's why when the kings come along, they kind of did what do? You look to the kings in scripture, and you just inherit. You just use the story of Israel and imagine that we are a little bit like them, and that eventually leads to William Blake and Jerusalem. So there's this inheritance of the idea of biblical history that meant that the Christian scholars, the monks particularly, were a gift to history because they became historians steeped as they were in biblical narrative. And biblical narrative is the source of English history. And so I find that fascinating, and it's because we don't seem to do that very much now. Made me ask why. Actually, we are at the moment, I feel, as a church, quite existential. Really, we're very much feel sometimes trapped in the present, and successive waves of social crisis and institutional crisis that beat upon us. And to remember the long story and to tell the long story is the way to endure. That's what, under persecution, that's where the book of Revelation emerges, isn't it? So that you've got the long, stretch out the story so that you can be patient in the present and you can endure. And so the retelling, the rediscovery of history, a history that leads somewhere, not that just leads up to the present, but a history that is incomplete, that's the important thing, is something that we should have a knack for as a religious culture, as a people. And therefore I'm wanting to promote that idea because I think it could be a really good contribution, because heaven knows nobody else is doing it at the moment.
Right. Yeah. Where else are you going to go to get that? Yeah. Whether folks that are listening, whether you've been to England or not, I think most of us are familiar with Stonehenge, and you have a section in the book about that too. Perhaps the world's most famous prehistoric monument that dates back thousands of years. And one of your reflections centers around the cuckoo stone, which is like this big 6-foot stone, and it's kind of off the beaten path a little bit. So being the good student that I am, I Googled cuckoo stone just to see a little bit more about it. And one of the myths that came out of my deep research was that this is like this stone that was dropped by the devil when he was bringing stones to Stonehenge. This was the backstory. But I know there's a deeper tale there, but that's perhaps another podcast. But the cuckoo stone, what basically you're pointing to is it's out of place, yet it is also part of the landscape that you're in and that you're looking at. And we can think about the church in that same light, because it's so true that the church is part of the landscape of our world. I mean, even we live in London, Ontario, you drive a block or two, you're going to see a building, right? You're going to see something, a denomination, and people will go church. But like those 12-year-olds, they probably don't know what it's for. But it's there and it's part of the landscape. Yet the church as the body of Christ in the world is also called to be outside of the world, even though it's part of that landscape. And I remember when I was reading this, clergy colleague saying when I first arrived in my first parish, which was in a very small town, that I was in the community, but I was not of the community. And I found that to be so true as I spent my time there. So can you say more about this idea of the church being in, but not of the world, and maybe how that informs how we are to be as followers in the way of Jesus?
It's a very powerful tension, and I've lived with it all my life, really. I think I mentioned this in the book, that I was always aware of that growing up as a vicarage child, as you said.
Sure.
I always knew that somehow we were at the middle of the village and at the margins of the village at the same time. So when I read years later Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Christology, right, that Christ stands at once in the center of community and on the edge of it, or the margins of it. Oh, wow, I know that.
Yeah, that's about it. Right?
That's exactly it. You know, that book's in the American edition. It's called Christ the Center, and he said, well, Christ was there. He was at the middle, and he stands at the center of the world. And the church must be, Bonhoeffer said, at the middle of the village. But it shouldn't claim any space for itself. It's merely pointing to the place to come.
Yeah.
And of course, whenever we become too landed, and we get examples of that taking place, judgment will step in. We need to be dispossessed. And I think one of the things that we're trying to discern at the moment with a slightly, although the Church of England is still incredibly privileged and, goodness me, incredibly landed too. You know, the church commissioners are in England own vast amounts of land. We're still richly landed. There is a sense in which perhaps we are increasingly culturally dispossessed, in that we don't own the narrative again,
right?
And we are seen as a curiosity, particularly when in state occasions we seem to be so central, and yet the rest of the time we're slightly awkwardly viewed in some respects. And so we are culturally in a curious place at the moment, but do retain this vestigial, residual role as a kind of custodian of our common life as it was, and the authority, such as it is, that carries, is rooted in local communities. And I feel very strongly that any authority that we retain as a church is only on the basis of our presence in every part of the country. So, and it's true of other denominations too. Wherever the Christian church is, it gets stuck in and it doesn't leave. You know, the other initiatives, projects, practices, professions tend to move through within a generation or two. The Christian church, when it sets up in a place, it tends to just abide. So we are deeply in the landscape, like the cuckoo stone. You know, it's several tons. You know, you're not going to the cuckoo stone's not going anywhere.
Not going anywhere.
Yeah, it is still an oddity, and it's still out of place.
Well, and aren't we called in a way to that sort of holy oddity, in a way, holy madness? You know that.
Yeah.
You know, and as Rob put it, in the world, not of the world, but to somehow. You know, Stanley Hauerwas years ago referred to it as resident aliens, right? That, you know, right? You know, just it's incredible. Again, another beautiful piece of the book. Yeah.
I really enjoyed that.
We have a relatively new segment to this podcast, Andrew, if you aren't aware. It's time for a thing that we like to call listener questions. Listener questions. Today's question comes from our guest. Today's question for our guest comes from Peter Anderson, who is in London, Ontario.
Peter,
His mother.
Hey, Peter. How you doing?
Big fan of Peter. His mom was actually from Devon. May she rest. Peter is a member of St. Aidan's Church, where he is also the church beekeeper. And this is his question.
Every church should have a beekeeper, shouldn't they?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Hello, Bishop. Peter Anderson here. It's so nice to have the opportunity to ask you a question. I'm very much enjoying English grounds. I'm fortunate that my family, having survived the Second World War, were clear-eyed to what you call the curse of British Christianity in the chapter Dieu et mon droit. Nationalist Christianity is a seduction for some that we see on the upswing here in North America. You say, eschatology may sound unhinged, but it is our exit from nationalism. Could you expand on that?
What a fantastic question. Thank you so much for asking that, Peter. And I'm trying to reckon with nationalism a lot in the book, actually, because I am a patriot, and therefore I've been trying to reckon with my love of country without that idolatry of the nation. And is there a way of doing that? Mm-hmm. And I said that about eschatology, really to refer back to some of the things that we've said in this hour, because the only way to escape from the idolatry of the present place is to realize that it isn't the end of the world, that it isn't the most important thing, and indeed is judged in the light of eternity. And so even in the most patriotic, almost nationalistic hymns that we have in England, there's a hymn we sing quite often at state occasions called "I Vow to Thee, My Country." Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, so that has a really intensely patriotic first verse, but the second verse, even in that hymn, has a corrective, mm-hmm. which begins, "But there's another country I've heard of long ago, more dear to them that love them," I think it goes, or still more dear to them that know. And it places the present country in the light of the kingdom of heaven, and insists that heaven is more dear still, and that all allegiances here below have to submit to in the light of Christ, actually, in the light of the coming kingdom. It's so easy for the present, and goodness me, the English church has done this again and again and again. For the present, certainly leadership and monarchy does this to use the light of eternity to give more power to itself in the present moment. Right. But actually, on every British coin is, the fact that you've got next to the Queen's inscription, you've got FD, Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, by the grace of God, Queen. There is still a kind of an echo of the fact that eternity is more important than the nation. We've got to really be able to love our place, whether it's the local community or whether it is the national community, in a way that does not idolize it and does not use that allegiance to oppress others, and moreover to use the privileges that we have to provide a place for those who don't have one. And this is the point about the parish again. So often nationalism is used as a way of excluding others. Right. Where actually, if you found your place, what does Jesus do? Say to you, if you found your place, you give up your place. That's right. First, you have to. Yeah. As soon as you get your place, you've got to. That's just good manners, isn't it? Yeah. On a railway carriage, you're sitting there. Even it says it on the windows. You see somebody who's pregnant or elderly. Yeah. Get out of the way. Yep. That's right. Yep. And nationally, how do we do that? How do we give up our seat? Right. For those who don't have homes. So for us, in England, people on rafts struggling to get to this country, give them a seat. Yes. Mm-hmm. Goodness sake. Yeah. So I think, Peter, that's what I'm feeling is if we love our country in the right way, we must give up our place too, surely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Ian, what say you? Yeah, I say that was so good that Peter gets a second question. That's what I say. Okay. So for sure. So let's share the screen again.
My second question strays a little bit from the book. Your chapter titled God's Acre put me in mind of a program I've heard about in England called Caring for God's Acre. I learned about the program in a conversation with a gardener in the north of England interested in keeping bees in a churchyard there. He emailed me after hearing about our beekeeping program that we run at St. Aidan's. Could you speak a little bit about Caring for God's Acre?
Oh, fabulous. And I genuinely love the idea of a beekeeper in a churchyard.
Yeah. Just a word about that, Andrew. He and this guy is a union organizer, plumber, and he and another parishioner at the time began beekeeping here a few years ago, and it took a while for the colony to build up and so on. But in the last couple of years, those bees have generated over $20,000, almost $30,000 actually worth of revenue. That's all gone into a community organization here called LUSO, which works towards deracializing and anti-racism in the schools, feeding new Canadians. All the proceeds from the bee ministry goes into the community, and Peter has been instrumental in making that happen. And so he got this email from some dude in the north of England saying, "What are you doing over there?" Which were, as you guys would say, we were chuffed. So you heard his question. I just add that little bit for context for you.
Oh, it's great context. Sweet honey from the rock.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, God's little acre, or God's acre, is a sort of a term that's sometimes been ascribed to churchyards, as you know, and I think it's important. I think churchyards, for a start, the first thing to say briefly is that churchyards are really interesting places because they're kind of church and kind of not. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be in the building, and many people, obviously, when they visit graves, they recognize that they're in a different kind of space, but it's not quite church, but it is holy. Mm-hmm. And I think that little liminal space, I think, is really interesting. It's a sort of penumbra of the church. Really. The other thing to say, I guess, is that when we sanctify or bless or make hallowed in some way a particular portion of ground, it is not to say that no other places are holy, but that every place is holy. So in the same way that the Sabbath is holy, it's meant to sanctify the whole week. It's not when we celebrate your birthday, it's not that the other 364 days of the year you're not special. It's to tell you that you are special all the time. So right. We get the point, but it's often used as sort of, this is holy ground and that's not, but that's just, woman at the well stuff, isn't it? That it's not this mountain or that mountain. The time is coming when it's not. When Jesus says that to the woman at the well, I don't think he's saying that henceforth, no, it's not going to be about place. He's not saying that, I don't think. I think he's saying that henceforth, by the Spirit, every place is going to be hallowed ground. Yes. Every mountain, every well is going to be a place of possible encounter with God. So when we call it God's acre, we really mean that every acre is God's. The cattle on 1,000 hills are his. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful. The book is English Grounds, a Pastoral Journal. There it is, folks. We encourage you to pick it up. There's going to be a link on our website, thevicarscrossing.com, so you can find it there. And Bishop Andrew Ramsey is the author and has been our guest on the Vicar's Crossing. And Bishop, thank you so much for staying up late after a busy day and spending time with us today. And hopefully maybe there'll be a couple of vicars knocking on your door in Wiltshire down the road. We love to get over there when all this craziness is over and come and see our good friends in England. So thanks so much for being here.
You'd be very welcome. It's been a delight. Thank you very much.
Let me just ask you one more thing before you go. We were originally doing this tomorrow, but you have a friend with a book release, yeah?
Yeah.
Who is that, and how do we get in touch?
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, you must read the book. Yeah. It's called Colin Heber Percy.
Okay.
And he's one of my colleagues who lives and works near me here, and it's not a dissimilar book to my own. So we had to take care not to write about exactly the same things.
Right.
And we're doing a few launch events actually together over the coming weeks, so it's well worth.
And his book is called
Tales from a Country Vicar.
Well, look for that one too, folks. Yeah. We'll and tell them we'll be in touch. And but thank you again for doing this today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good night.
And again, thanks to Bishop Andrew for his time tonight and for his wonderful gift of this book. And looking forward to reading more sections of this. I didn't get through the whole thing. It's one of those books to be savored because each chapter is really rich in imagery and thought.
The words are not wasted, right? So every word is heavy, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why I feel like, and I don't mean heavy in a hard way. I mean, it's just that it's saturated. These posts that he puts in there, I post as an internet age, but each of these chapters, like they're weighted with meaning.
Right. Yep. So, thanks to our sponsors again today, to A. Miller George Funeral Home. where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Also, thanks to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Thanks, guys. Appreciated the time today. Appreciate the conversation, and we'll look forward to getting together again next time in the Vickers Crossing. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
Remember, Kevin, to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Could be crocodiles.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!